Today I'm joined by Charles Haywood. Charles is a successful entrepreneur, an ex-lawyer, I think, and the maximum leader of the Worthy House, which is an excellent blog slash magazine where he reviews a variety of books, and I think he also has articles that are not necessarily based on books, but kind of the book review is the format that he goes for mostly. And he brings a very interesting perspective to it, which is kind of a right-wing post-liberal lens, which kind of I've been immersed in recently as well. So thank you for coming on, Charles.
Thank you. I am very pleased to be here.
Yeah, it's great because I've definitely been listening to a lot of your material, and because you write the articles, but then you also record them as a podcast, which is very helpful for people who do things in life, like.
Yes. Originally, I started writing book reviews simply because it helped me remember the books I had read. I don't have a great memory, and I just started writing book reviews, and I would post them on Amazon and what have you. And then people started reading them. This is 2017 or so. And 2 years ago, I started doing the podcast version, which is, to me at least, startlingly popular. I guess people prefer to consume a lot of stuff in audio rather than written stuff because more people do the audio versions, I think, probably than certainly in terms of reading the whole thing. I tend to write fairly lengthy pieces in a lot of cases. I think audio makes it easier for people to consume that in bits and pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely a big fan of that. Whenever I can get something in audio, I'm just gonna do that because I like to, I don't know, be doing stuff as well. But the one thing that kind of stood out for me from your work is that you're probably one of the most meticulous chroniclers of what I call the post-liberal moment, which essentially involves many branches, many authors, many people that have something to throw their hat in the ring about post-liberalism. I'm curious how you got to this point. What was the moment that made you think about liberalism and say, hey, whoa, there's something about this that doesn't quite make sense?
This is an excellent question, and not one I think I've actually addressed on the blog. So here we go. This is to all the people out there listening. This is a first. So I was raised, I would say, mainstream conservative. There's with some wrinkles. I was raised on a steady diet of Hungarian irredentism, which you may find interesting because my mother's Hungarian, and I learned all about Transylvania and its true owners, the Hungarians, from an early age. But aside from that,
yeah.
I mean, this was the late '80s, or mid-late '80s when I was coming of age, and conservatism had basically one stream that was mainstream, which is Reaganism, which now, of course, has mutated into zombie Reaganism, as they say. So, but I was indistinguishable from all the other college Republicans in the late 1980s. And then I went to law school, as you mentioned, and I practiced as a mergers and acquisitions lawyer for several years, 5 years, 6 years, something like that. And this was in the 90s. And of course, in the 90s, everybody thought that communism was over, and so everything was going to be great forever. And I was not particularly politically involved. So really only in the 2000s did I start to get back into reading extensively and start really getting back into thinking. And I'm ashamed to admit it, but I supported George W. Bush. I know that's terrible now. George W. Bush, as I like to say, God rot him. I was all excited when he got elected in 2000 and 2004. So I have many sins to atone for. But I think even if you read some of my stuff in 2016, I was still, I would not say particularly post-liberal at that point. I think I'm sorry about the dog in the background here. You're gonna have to cut this out.
No worries. No, it's all part of the pirate radio appeal.
So, okay, good. So we have an elderly dog and she likes to bark and stuff. So really, if you sat down and parsed through my readings, it was really around 2018, I would say, I really began to turn against the globalism and neoliberalism. And I hesitate to use those terms because a lot of people overuse them and they're somewhat opaque to a lot of people simply because of the different uses put on them. But really around 2018, I began to fully realize that many of the elements of our current political moment our current political culture, we're not just bad in the sense of needing some policy changes, but we're bad in the sense of irredeemable, needing to be wholly removed and reworked. That doesn't mean that I have a particular ideology. This is not, I'm very careful to stay away from ideology. I don't have a 100% answer to things, but everything begins with the rebuilding of an entirely new system rather than the modification of the existing system. And that's very strange for someone like me who grew up always thinking that what you need to do is elect some new people and then they're going to change things. Or the old kind of Republican thing where if we get to more people on the Supreme Court, then we're going to get to the things that we want. Eventually, you realize that that's a dead end. And I think that's the single biggest split between people like me and people who, baby boomers, kind of stereotypically, who think that a little bit more Reaganism is going to make it all better. Nothing's going to make it all better except a complete reworking of the system. So that puts me in the post-liberal camp.
Was it you being in the middle of the system, being a lawyer, getting mugged by reality, or was it from a specific reading that you had an epiphany, or both?
Also a good question. As I say on my description on the blog, I'm a class traitor and a regime enemy. So honestly, everybody I know is kind of, from my background, I really should be, I was a member of the professional managerial elite. I was a mergers and acquisitions lawyer at a big law firm. And I wouldn't say there was one particular epiphany. I think that I realized eventually that things had to change. And I think part of it is having children. So we have several children, and you kind of project the future forward, and you look around at the clown show, as I like to call it, and you realize that nothing good is going to happen for your children unless things change. And eventually you realize that things aren't changing. And to the extent they're changing in the wrong direction. So they're definitely changing. Everything's changing always in the wrong direction. And many people have made this point. This is certainly not original to me. But I think having children accelerates the need to do something about that. On the other hand, it's also true that if I'd stayed as a lawyer, I would never have done any of this, because you can't do these things, even if you operate under a pseudonym. Originally, I operated just under my first name, because I was running a business. But as a lawyer, you're in a big law firm now, or even in a small law firm, you just simply can't say these things. So the reason I was able to kind of take this tack and think these subversive thoughts is that I had run my own business, and then I sold my own business, and so now I can do what I want. That's nice for me, but there's all these people out there who can't do that, and that's tragic in a sense. On the other hand, I'm very optimistic in the sense that I think there are a tremendous amount of people out there who are willing to adopt new ideas, who are simply unable to express them. And so I think part of my role, and your role obviously, is to say these thoughts for people so that they know that it's okay to think these thoughts. And one of my hobby horses is we need less policing, rightward policing. The right has historically spent in my lifetime far too much time policing its rightward boundaries. That doesn't mean that I want to accept every single person who might be categorized as on the right as someone I want to party with all the time. But generally speaking, the more subversive thoughts, the better. And we can build a body of thought out of that will be useful when the time comes.
Yeah, I completely agree. The no friends to the right approach seems to be like essentially maybe 80% of right-wing punditry. There's always just a gatekeeping, 20% is freaking out and hand-wringing about all the bad stuff that's happening. Look at these wokesters. Oh, how amazing. Mm-hmm. And then the rest is just like, oh no, we're not these guys. Well, that's not how you do politics.
You know who originally used the phrase "no enemies to the left"? Alexander Kerensky of Lenin in the July days before Lenin took over and kicked Kerensky out. So,
is that the famous photo of Kerensky? I don't know.
It might be. I'm not sure, but he failed to purge Lenin when Lenin tried to take over the first time. with the phrase "no enemies to the left," and he proceeded to, very much like the current moment after what I like to call the electoral justice protest of January 6th, very much to a search for imaginary right-wing enemies, when of course Kerensky's problem was left-wing enemies, but he refused to recognize that.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you were anonymous for a while. What do you think about this kind of this right wing anonymous culture? That's, I'm very adjacent to that. Those are my online friends, and I really like it. But I'm curious what you now have the proverbial FU money, which is a very good place to be in. Do you think there's place for dissidents? Face forward dissidents, even without that? Would you have done that if you didn't have fun?
Absolutely. I think there's a place for everybody. And I think there's an awful lot of people who have to remain anonymous. I don't buy into the idea that anonymity undercuts the benefit of a particular thinker. On the other hand, I also don't think that some people maintain that anonymity is a positive good in and of itself. I don't think that's true necessarily. I think the movement, for lack of a better term, requires both. And certainly my responsibility is to operate because I can under my own name. I remember when I first started using my own name, which was last year, some friends of mine said, right-wing friends of mine said, well, why are you doing that? That seems to me you're taking some sort of risks. And my response was, because I'm not in the apologies business, I'm in the winning business. And so if you're really going to win, you have to use your own name. If someone who is anonymous can only contribute to the discussion, someone who uses his own name can actually do something. And what that is, right now it's not clear what do is. But for example, if there was a regime change, someone who operates under his own name can easily slot into a new regime. Obviously, an anonymous person can do that as well, but you have some more of a presence if you have your own name. That doesn't mean that I'm angling to be the next dictator or something. That sounds like an awful lot of work, and I kind of enjoy my life. I would rather be an advisor to the man of destiny than the man of destiny myself. But operating under your own name, if you can, I think gives you more options as to what to do in the future.
Yeah, there's just also kind of a pipeline that I've noticed building in these kind of fringe circles. Like you have the hard anonymous people, the ones that have no voice, no face, 7 layers of OPSEC, who can essentially mine the fringes. They go deep, the theory cells, and they, excavate weird bits of things that no one can talk about. And then, they get booted off 7 times, and then they come back in different guises. And, that's kind of like, the miners at the edge of the empire just digging in the dark gold. And then there's kind of layers of anonymity up to the point where I'm essentially kind of exploring these waters. I'm swimming in them. I'm, looking at the nuggets, getting shocked by some of the stuff that I see, but, also kind of bringing back the red pills, the black pills, whatever, and kind of, in a way, not necessarily laundering them, but, presenting them in a way that's palatable to, people who maybe at least occasionally use their own names and own faces in polite society.
I think the ferment is extremely valuable. And I'm as worried as the next guy about censorship on Twitter and social media and so on. Those things are problematic, but the ferment itself largely manages to route around a lot of those things. So I'm a big fan of the potential for technology. And of course, I see obviously a lot of the potential drawbacks for technology. I'm violently anti-transhumanist and things like that. But the reality is that as the regime crumbles, which I'm placing my bets that the regime will crumble and that soon, the ability to communicate in particular in a way that was simply not possible even 10 or 15 years ago is invaluable. And so while it is true that there is censorship, it's also true that the same censorship that exists because new technologies create the need and possibility for the regime to censor also allow people to route around that to a large degree in a way that even in the 1980s, if you wanted to run a newsletter, you had to Xerox it and send it snail mail. It just seems insane in retrospect. Now you can communicate even with the censorship with a much larger group of people.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the amount of, Signal chats and Discord servers and places where I could essentially find probably almost all the people that I'm interested in the world,
Mhm.
is quite significant. Even if, Twitter or whoever decides to unperson me tomorrow, and that's good. I mean, Twitter. I think Twitter is really useful in a way, and there's this whole violent backlash that you've seen. The purges, the waves, the it feels like the kind of the knee jerk reactions of a crumbling regime. It's just ridiculous. It's like it doesn't make sense even from a customer service perspective. It's just essentially purging. Yeah, I don't know. It feels like that's a good sign. I don't know. Is it a good sign?
I think it is a good sign. My opinion is that, and obviously a lot of people disagree with me on this, but I'm a history guy. My opinion is that the regime is extremely fragile, and I don't think this idea of a technological dystopia where the bad people sit on us for the next 500 years has any validity whatsoever. This is, I was discussing, as you know, with on a podcast with Michael Anton the other day, and this is his idea that if conservatives of whatever stripe are even remotely correct, the regime is doomed in the relatively near future. Now, it could be that conservatives or right-wing people are just completely wrong, and the future is, a technological hell combination of 1984 and Brave New World forever, but probably not. I'm putting my money against that. So I think the next major challenge to the regime, external challenge, will almost certainly knock over, in essence, the entire liberal democratic order. We'll see. I could be wrong. I was wrong before once or twice.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds kind of dystopian and hopeful at the same time, obviously, because we're a bit we're in the same camp. But it does kind of sound a bit, scary, because this is kind of why people don't want to dig too deep into the post-liberal idea, because it is just so far from the known waters, and it's just so exotic and weird, and all the alternatives sound so scary, and they all harken back to things that have weird connotations, like the medieval connotations
Mm-hmm.
that
I like medieval. My favorite period of history, not favorite in the sense that I necessarily want to live there, though in many ways I think that would be much better than people think. But my favorite in terms of interest in reading about is medieval history. And most people have no conception of what medieval life was really like. I actually have a book review of a classic book, Life in a Medieval City, by a husband and wife couple called Gies or Gies. I think I did this a couple of years ago. But life in a medieval city was actually pretty good. Western European medieval society was basically nothing like you see it in the movies. And it wasn't like Braveheart, and you have all these myths surrounding it. So I think that's mostly a question of, we've been propagandized into thinking in essence, by the Enlightenment and by various Enlightenment thinkers, into thinking two things: but the past was dreadful, and that progress in the sense of technological or scientific progress is connected in some way to the Enlightenment, to the idea of emancipation being the prime political goal of human life. Both those things are completely false. The past was actually pretty good, and you could, in my imagining, a future society that throws overboard essentially all elements of the Enlightenment and maintains the good parts of the modern world, what I like to call the high Middle Ages with rockets. So, that's what we need. And so I think that's feasible. But we've been propagandized into thinking that the bad things of modernity, which our enemies think are the good things of modernity, go along with and are necessarily partnered with what I think are the good things of modernity. I think those things can be split and will be split, whether we like it or not. So we can be scared or we can not be scared, but it's coming for us regardless, and for our children. So sticking our heads in the sand isn't going to be really useful.
Yeah. So the Enlightenment wasn't the moment where they invented reason, was it?
No, not at all. So I write on this fairly extensively, but the reason. I listened to your podcast with Darren Beatty the other day, and unlike Beatty, I know nothing about Heidegger and cannot go on a great length about philosophy, and will not go on a great length about philosophy, though that was very interesting. So, but in short, reason obviously has nothing whatsoever to do with the Enlightenment, having begun in the West, 2,500 years before. And my bigger focus, rather than reason, since I don't really do philosophy because I regard myself as unqualified, the scientific approach to reason and the subset of reason that relates to the development of scientific technology predated, I can't even get my vocabulary right, predated the Enlightenment by a couple of hundred years. And it was a function of Western Europe, largely mediated by the church. So the exact opposite of what children are taught in schools today, much of which is the result of Enlightenment propagandists combined with anti-Catholic propagandists, which is not exactly the same thing, but has a heavy overlap. So none of these things are necessary. We can throw the Enlightenment out entirely, forget it ever happened, and live happily ever after, or at least as happily as human beings can ever live.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's one of those, very hard to swallow pills for the the rationalist, neoliberal, yeah, whatever you want to call it. The person of the smart person of today. It's not a hardly digestible idea, but yeah.
Wasn't it you who, I think it was one of your podcasts just the other day, where you were saying how the new atheists, being a new atheist is low status now? And so if the new atheists become low status, we just need to extend that principle to everybody who believes in Enlightenment and make them all low status, and have the people who believe in a different future be the high status people. Status matters, right? And one of my overriding principles, which I probably say too much, is how terrible our current ruling class is. But every society has a ruling class. We just get rid of the existing ruling class and have a new set of high status people who produce a different society. It sounds simple, but it's always devil's in the details. But that's the theory, right?
Yeah, this is kind of the great man of history branch of how things develop, and I think I'm partial to that as well. I think it's surprising how a handful of people can move the course. Wasn't that there's a quote by Napoleon about him finding the crown of France lying in the street and picking it up with a sword.
Yes.
Maybe that's the next step for someone.
I'm putting my money on that. Not literally. I'm not really a betting guy. I go to Vegas rarely, and when I do, I play nickel slots or something like that. But if I was a betting guy, I would place my bets on that kind of scenario. It's interesting. I'm reading a book right now on the period between the end of the French Revolution and Napoleon's accession to power. So basically, what they call the Directory period before Napoleon took over, which has shockingly few books on it. I had to dig really hard to find books on it, because I think that moment when what is to be done after a left-wing ascendancy is defeated, and to change from that governance system to something new, is actually very instructive. So if you're into that, wait a couple months and you'll see my thoughts on that on my site.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's very few moments in history that are quite comparable to the current one, or the one that we're expecting now with bated breath. Mm-hmm. So, and I want to go a little bit deeper into post-liberalism, because I said you're the main man to see for this type of thinking, and you've kind of had built a structure around it. So you kind of have these three branches of post-liberalism, one of which you identify with a bit closer, and two of which you don't, not at all. So the first one is people who still endorse the Enlightenment, who think that the American project went off the rails a bit later down the line. It wasn't straight at the moment of Enlightenment. Then there is the very familiar to probably many of my audience, the kind of dark Enlightenment, Neoreaction direction, kind of this tech atheist, accelerationist type thinking, and then there is one strain of it that I think you've given it the name, the Augustan strain, and they take kind of a dim view of democracy, but are either ambivalent or hostile about the Enlightenment, but they're not necessarily hostile to religion, or they're not atheists, or is this a good summary?
Yes, absolutely. So I mean, my thoughts on that is particularly on the Augustan. I'm a power guy. I'm not really a philosophy guy. Philosophy is important in the sense that it can inform people's decisions, but a lot of people spend entirely too much time on philosophy, whether that's political philosophy or any kind of philosophy. And one thing a lot of people don't realize is that we think of ancient Greek philosophers as men who were highly honored in their own society. And that, in fact, was not the case. Philosophy was looked down on, and not just Socrates and his supposed corruption of Athenian youth, but in general, philosophers were not honored in their own time because most societies are busy getting on with the business of life, not thinking great thoughts. That doesn't mean there's not a role for great thoughts, but I'm in the business of figuring out what the tools and outline of a future society that permits human flourishing are. And there's a role for thinking about that, but functionally, a society that is new or reborn or renewed has to be an organic thing. If the past 150 years, or all the way back to the French Revolution, say, have taught us anything, it's that ideologically based societies, where you think in your mind what the society should look like and attempt to implement that in practice, are a disaster on every level, and always are and always will be. So you have to accept that a society is organic, and you have to accept that and act on it in the sense of setting up structures that allow that to happen in a way that has some amount of guidance, because libertarianism is a dead end, complete libertarianism, but without having any of the other, you don't want a tyranny, obviously. And this is now I'm sounding like a political philosopher again. So my classic example of this, though there's others, is the Augustan age, which is people like Anton focuses on the term of Caesarism, the ending of the Roman Republic. But Augustus was the one who built the new society, a new thing for a new time, informed by the wisdom of the old. And he had luck, and he was an interesting personality, and nothing succeeds like success. If he had been a big disaster, we would remember him differently. But it shows that it can be done. You can take a society that is in turmoil, that has real problems, and you can create a society that works for a lengthy period of time. Obviously, our society that is similar, if someone took up the Napoleonic challenge of picking up the crown with his sword, you have a lot of risks. It could be disastrous. But you could also end up with, if it was properly done and a variety of things broke our way, with a renewed Western society. And since one of my premises is that essentially the only good things that have ever been accomplished, broadly speaking, for humanity, for mankind, have been done by the West, all other civilizations either being of limited accomplishment or stagnancy, it has to be done in the West. And so what I reject is as I say, the philosophy of the Enlightenment in general. So I part company to a certain degree with the Straussians and so on. And we had a whole discussion about that earlier. And then the Dark Enlightenment types, I have a fairly well-trafficked, actually very heavily trafficked piece attacking Curtis Yarvin. I like Curtis Yarvin. I think he's interesting. I have a number of very specific criticisms, which I won't narrate here. But the single thing is that you can't view human beings instrumentally. Everything has to be organic. And if you view human beings as a clay that you can manipulate in order to create a specific kind of society, or clay that you can let run free and will self-organize to create some wonderful society, or clay that you can technologically manipulate in some transhumanist way to create something that will be different and wonderful for no obvious reason, those things are all dead ends. In many ways with humanity, there is no thing new under the sun. And you have to take what it is, set up the right structures, and hope it works out. There you go. Hope an asteroid doesn't hit us. And one of the reasons I'm also very big on space exploration, that's a different topic. So my Augustan age will include interstellar is a bit is very hopeful and aspirational, intrasolar exploration.
Yeah, that's an interesting side to it. I think maybe I'm really trying to get on the level where this stuff is interesting to me, but I think I'm just like too female brained, even with everything that's gone wrong.
Space, you mean?
Yeah, I'm just does not Compute.
It's funny, I run into a lot of people who say that space doesn't compute, doesn't have any attraction, and then you also have people who are that's simply stupid, simply because every environment outside of Earth is so challenging that it's the chances of us being able to do anything, at least sending manned spacecraft anywhere or colonizing Mars or what have you, is low. And all that's probably true, but that is, first of all, it doesn't preclude things like unmanned exploration, asteroid mining, and so on. And the society needs stretch goals. The no stretch goals, there are many, many problems, even aside from the Enlightenment, with today's societies. We don't have stretch goals. We don't have any children. Everybody's old. Everybody's rich. Everybody's complacent, but unhappy and alienated. I don't really have great solutions for those things, but I do think that giving society a stretch goal, namely space exploration, the conquest of space, is likely, given historical analogs, to yield very rich dividends for the society. And failing to have a stretch goal leads to complacency and stagnation.
Isn't that a little bit trying to mold the putty of humanity? If you impose the stretch goal of society.
No, because you only have a percentage of the people who act towards the stretch goal. The rest of the people benefit from it either materially, in the sense of they get the fruits of whatever the people who are doing the exploration do, or they benefit from it psychically. They see that as a society, they're bound together by this common achievement. Right now, we have no common, I mean, seriously, if you think about it, in the West at least, there's no commonality. There's no sense. You see, for example, with the COVID, these, in America at least, you see these signs, we're all in this together, which of course is the exact opposite of the truth. We're not at all in this together for any number of reasons, but there's nothing that we're all in together nowadays. We're all in this together in the sense that in America, we live in this country, but you have very little commonality and you have no coherent vision of the good or of what the society should accomplish. Without that, the society is going to fail. So it doesn't have to be the conquest of space. I mean, I don't know, it could be digging to the core of the earth, like that movie 20 years ago. What was that called? The Core, where they send the ship to the middle of the earth. It could be something like that, but you have to have some common goal.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's the challenge of the common part of it. I think is kind of lays heavy on me as well, because it's the idea that you have to get people excited about it. I talk to tech bros and people obsessed with aliens and space, and I still am not excited about space. So I'm like, I don't know. I get easily excited, but how to communicate the vision of the future.
Well, I think sadly that's a second order problem, because we have to get through the existing set of problems and defenestrate our current ruling class.
Well, that's exciting.
Right. So that'll be exciting for us all, and probably far more exciting than we really want. What that defenestration looks like, I don't know. My kind of current thinking tends to revolve around their best case scenario is a split of the country. But we'll see. Again, it's very fragile, and as with so many of these things, nothing can be predicted in advance. But once we're through that, what Toynbee would have called the time of troubles, which is inevitable in every civilization, we'll see where it goes from there.
Yeah, but the country is arguably already splitting, with essentially, mass migrations of different types of people from one corner to the other. Poor Boise, poor Salt Lake City, poor I don't know, Phoenix,
Austin.
Austin's gone already. We scratched that.
It is splitting, but the central government and ruling class is not giving up any of its power. Quite the contrary. So it doesn't matter if a bunch of people sort themselves into blocks so that you have more red states and more blue states, because the ruling class dominates all through its hold on various levers of power. And so the breaking of that hold is the thing that's necessary. And by breaking, I don't think that it makes any sense for people to go out and try to break that hold. Rebellion is typically a complete waste of time, and it's definitely a waste of time now. So I don't think people should go out and rebel. But eventually, in the nature of things, the hold on these levers of power is going to crumble, and then back to Napoleon and picking up the crown. Someone will pick up that crown.
Yeah, yeah. You think kind of the avenue is going to be kind of the emperor's new clothes, just a critical mass of people realizing that it's a sham. So no need for January 6th redos and feeding the beast.
Well, I was a big fan of January 6th, and I think it was an excellent event. But I don't think it's an excellent event in the sense of useful for accomplishing its end goals. It's useful for demonstrating the will of the people and that the people can, in fact, act together. But you don't need to do that again. And of course, the state is looking out for that and is eager to use that in its propaganda campaigns and crush people and so on. So as with anything, these things will become evident almost certainly from some kind of external shock. Again, if I was a betting man, I would bet on economic collapse. This is, of course, hardly something that's original, that the government's printing so much money and so much of the economy is completely fake that it seems inevitable that eventually there'll be a comeuppance. And you can bear a comeuppance when your society is strong and resilient, but you cannot bear a comeuppance when it's not. And so you look at historical examples like the 1923 German hyperinflation, which is different in many ways, obviously, but that was very tough on Germany. But the Germans of the 1920s have a lot more resiliency than the Americans of the 2020s. They just do. And so in a similar situation here, everything would, I think, just fall apart. And I'm sorry to make all my conversation makes me sound like a complete doomer, which I'm not. I'm extremely optimistic. I regard doom as a necessary step and a temporary step on the road to future success. So I'm not a guy on the right who's been getting a lot of attention lately is a guy, Paul Kingsnorth. I don't know if you've heard of him. I think he's a Welshman, but he's in the UK somewhere. He's a former Wiccan priest who has now become Orthodox, but is part of something called the Dark Mountain Project. In fact, maybe you should reach out to this guy. So he's pushing this idea that we're going to have a complete and total collapse back to, in essence, Bronze Age standards, which I don't think any of that is even remotely possible, but he's a very interesting guy. Do you ever read First Things, which is a publication here? He has an article on in the most recent edition, which is very much worth reading on his kind of journey and his thoughts about the future. I think he would fit right into some of your thinking.
Oh, really? Oh.
So go, Paul Kingsnorth is the name. He's quite good.
Paul Kingsnorth. Okay.
But my point is, I don't think I see a bright and shining future for humanity, and I am here to help us get there, and in my own small way. I'm not the doomer. I don't think we're all going to go Mad Max and sit around burning trash in barrels and warming our hands over it for the next 600 years. Right? I think people are resilient. Ultimately, our society has no resiliency, but people are resilient, and with the right actions, we can get to where we want to go.
Yeah, and power abhors a vacuum. I don't expect Mad Max to happen just because it's completely against human nature. One person will show up with his sword to find the crown somewhere in the foothills of.
But people just won't abide anarchy. I mean, they'll always organize on a local level. So I mean, I like everybody, dystopian movies are fun. Though the most recent Mad Max movie was terrible. But I grew up in the original Mad Max movies when Mel Gibson was young, and so I much prefer those. But I don't think they're realistic because there's no example in human history of any kind of society like that.
Yeah. So I want to go back to the post-liberal moment. I know you've been chatting about these people. We chat to some of these people. I want to just ask you, okay, what, like, for example, Michael Anton, he's probably one of the more, convincing and out there, relatively post-liberal. He's kind of straddling the line a little bit. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what does he get wrong? What would be your main bone to pick with him
Sure.
be?
My disagreement with Anton is that I think the current system is doomed, and he thinks the current system is at least potentially redeemable. And I don't think, I won't presume to speak for Anton, of course, but I think he might or might not be certain in that. But I just regard everything as that happened politically now as shadow play. It doesn't matter at some level. It's interesting, and we talk about it, and people talk about it on Twitter, which I try to stay off. I'm on Twitter occasionally, but I absolutely refuse to put Twitter on my phone because that way lies madness. So I'll only do Twitter on a desktop. So it's all shadow play. It doesn't really matter that Dementia Joe is president because it could be anybody. It doesn't matter if Dementia Joe goes into the long-term care home and Harris becomes president. It doesn't really matter if Trump is president. None of this matters. It's a shadow play. And so if you're Anton, my guess is, and has written his book, The Stakes, which is excellent, analyzes the future, but it analyzes through the prism of current structures. And I think current structures are back to what did you say about earlier? I guess it was not recording about ants eating the wood or termites eating the wood, right? So the current system is basically this termite riddled hell that doesn't really matter. And so my guess is that Anton, or my opinion is that what Anton gets wrong is that there's any point in really putting effort into reforming the current structures and systems. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything politically, because first of all, on the local level, there's some benefit to being involved in pushing back against your enemies, the left, what have you. And it's also important to organize locally, because if you do local political organizing, you're creating structures that are useful in the future. But I'm not going to spend a bunch of time agonizing about who becomes president in 2024, because it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Tucker Carlson becomes president. I mean, yes, it's true that Tucker Carlson is more disciplined than Trump and would probably pick better advisors, but he wouldn't be able to do anything either because he doesn't control the levers of power. I mean, everybody knows this. This is not news. And so wasting one's time on national politics has a certain degree of enjoyment, has a certain degree of pull as what I would call a rearguard action. I mean, if your enemies are after you and want to punish you, pushing back against them, it seems like it's something you not only should do, but have to do. And that's probably true at some level if you're being actually attacked. But most people, I think, should simply ignore national politics. I mean, I think in my Augustan society, almost everybody should ignore politics. But in the present moment, national political action just doesn't make a lot of sense. And so, again, if that's why I part company with some other people on the right who think that there's some value to working hard at current electoral politics.
Yeah, and that puts you squarely in the Yarvin camp.
It does.
What's your bone to pick with him?
Well, yeah, I have about 25,000 words about that. I think a lot of Yarvin's thought is very interesting. I disagree with him on, as I say, the instrumentalist view of humans. I disagree with him on a lot of his technical things. I think a lot of his history is simply wrong. I think a lot of his analysis of corporate activity, his idea for new kinds of corporate forms of government, don't make any sense. And but I think my biggest single complaint, again, I hesitate because I like Yarvin. I think he's very interesting. I think he's very valuable. I think spending your time fighting among post-liberals isn't a useful thing to do. And I don't want to be known as the anti-Yarvin guy, because I'd rather have Yarvin than almost anybody else on the left, certainly. But I think my biggest single objection is that he would completely deny this, but I think his view of politics is not based on the reality of human nature. He has an ideological view of how things should be structured. Again, he would completely deny this, but my basic point in my very lengthy piece is that he doesn't see the reality of human beings, and he doesn't organize around that reality, rather the reverse.
Okay, and what's kind of the point that he doesn't get about human nature? What is it about the human animal that is foreign to Curtis?
Well, it's been a couple of years since I wrote the piece, so I'd have to go back and refresh my recollection. But whenever he talks about people and he talks about history, he tends to cherry pick episodes from history, and I don't have one at hand, so you have to forgive me. But he tends to cherry pick episodes that are designed to show that people act in a way that Curtis Yarvin has already decided fits in with what he thinks his program should be, rather than going through all of history and seeing how people act, and from that deriving what the structures of his future society should be. It's very abstract, and then uses examples which are frequently simply wrong, inaccurate in one way or another, about that in order to support his very interesting theoretical concepts. It's not organic. And that's in part what I mean by he has an instrumentalist view of human beings. My opinion is that in his mind, human beings are little counters to be fit into a larger structure that is created in the abstract. And that is the fundamental failing of most political philosophers.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I can understand that. I mean, I think maybe that's why he was so engaging for a lot of readers of the blog, because he has a way of picking out.
He's very valuable. I mean, I think everyone should read Curtis Yarvin, and you should also read my piece on him, because why not? but I mean, you can do a lot worse. And he has a Substack, which is a Gray Mirror or something, which is really good. I mean, this is not bash Curtis Yarvin. In the new Augustan age, Curtis Yarvin will have an honored position as court philosopher or something.
I completely agree, because a lot of the pushback that I get as well when talking about these things is that, oh, this is how can you afford to be talking about these things if you're not coming to the table with a completed philosophical and political formula that you should present so that it can be implemented tomorrow in an easy way, so that we can just slot into this new regime form. And I'm like, I'm one of these people just stumbling in the dark, reading books from 100 years ago about people that they're out of print, just to kind of get my mind around what this can even be. 1 second. Yeah, good. So so that's a bit, the fact that we're not necessarily bickering, but disagreeing about some things, and then kind of the post-liberal field. I think it's absolutely natural, and it's healthy, and I think even Curtis probably supports it, because I'm sure he likes the fact that a lot more people are thinking about this. It lifts his star as much as everyone else's. So I think it's
absolutely. I mean, the future will be revealed to us by definition, and being informed by various lines of thought is helpful in reacting appropriately to what the future holds. Because most of the people in the modern society are sedated. This is again like James Poulos. You can listen to Poulos, and he talks about this much more eloquently than I could talk about it. The sedation that the modern world tries to offer people is extremely damaging. And so anything where you can step outside of that and say, I'm not going to spend my time playing video games and watching porn, but instead I'm going to think about what X, Y, or Z has to say, that's what's going to make a decent future possible. People breaking out of their shells. I mean, I try to stay away from the Matrix analogies, but it is very Matrixy, right? You break out of that unreality into a new reality, and what you need is people who will help wherever people are along that stage. I mean, I used to be a zombie Reaganite. I'm not a zombie Reaganite anymore. That wasn't just because I woke up. It's because I read other people who were instrumental in going down that path.
Yeah, exactly. And it does feel to me like one of maybe the major obstacles, that Poulos highlights is this. I think Helen Andrews calls it, limbic capitalism. This
Hmm.
algorithmic capitalism. It really is very effective, and it is very lulling. It's really like a sedative. I mean, what's the critical mass of people that you need to actually turn the ship around if everyone's just being fed by the machine?
Well, I went to the University of Chicago, which is all law and economics and cost benefit analysis and so on. So the answer is that it depends on the cost benefit ratio. And right now, where people live in the pod, again, a Poulosism, they live in the pod and but they have jobs. They eat the bugs. They live in the pod. They watch the porn. They don't see a lot of benefit to them to doing anything else, and they don't see a lot of costs to their current existence. Though I would argue that that existence has huge costs, but your average person probably doesn't think that. That's not going to go on forever because it was Ben Stein famously said, if something can't go on forever, it won't. So eventually the cost benefit analysis will change. And it's at that point that people start to wake up. And this is true for any society throughout history. People have inertia, complacency. And then one day they wake up and everything's different. I'm reading right now a book called Fifth Sun about a revisionist history of the Aztecs. And so the Aztecs are the classic example of this, and you see this in movies all the time. The Aztecs are on top of the world, though it is also true they only took over the area they were occupying like 100 years before Cortez arrived. And then one day the Europeans arrive and everything goes to hell for them. That's what happens to every society. And so eventually people will wake up, and limbic capitalism depends upon not having any countervailing force. And so when there's a countervailing force, whether that's people can't feed their children, or the asteroid has darkened the sky and there's no food, whatever. Limbic capitalism is a fragile thing that's very weak and only exists because people and only can succeed because people are complacent. As soon as people face challenges, as society faces challenges, these things are going to disappear. And Poulos, I think, is probably a bit more of a believer in strong AI and the algorithm. I think the algorithm, strong AI is completely insane, will never happen. The algorithm is, the example I always use is YouTube subtitles. That is, here we are in what is this year? 2021, thank you. And YouTube still can't auto-generate subtitles and videos that are anything but look like linear B, the Minoan script, and so I mean, we hear all the time about how, and Elon Musk, who I really like, tells us how AI is going to eat our lunch. AI is never going to happen. It can't even do like algorithms. And so limbic capitalism exists in the sense that algorithms can feed us things on social media and so on, but it's never going to get any better. And as our society decays due to excessive amounts of lack of focus on excellence and rather giving things to people on the basis of their identitarian characteristics, will accomplish less and less. We'll asymptotically approach accomplishing nothing, or maybe negative, maybe asymptotic, and we'll just cross the axis and we'll affirmatively destroy social capital and social accomplishment and scientific accomplishment. So I'm not worried about limbic capitalism keeping us all sedated forever, because the challenges will arrive and then the party's on. I'm just waiting for the party to start.
Okay, that's interestingly a mix of doomers and optimism, which I think we've come to expect of you. Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think Tyler Cowen always has this. He's kind of the court philosopher at the moment. The idea that there's just going to be these farms of people who are hooked up to stimulation machines, and that's where we put the people who were, to be honest, not going to be very productive in the new symbol manipulation economy that we're building. And you have these high class people, actually making the robots that feed us all. I don't know what to think about that, because that's like you said, that involves the idea that it's going to be linear. Everything's going to continue on a linear path, and if we go down the road that we're already on, then yeah, probably, I guess, people are
Two things. I hate Tyler Cohen. Not personally. I've never met him, but I just think everything he says is terrible. And so I have a couple of reviews just viciously slicing up some of his books. So and that's one of the ideas I object to. This idea that the robots are going to put us all in the pods and we're going to be happy. But he exemplifies, and I think you're exactly right. My favorite quote, which I probably overuse, and perhaps you've heard, or one of my favorite quotes that George Orwell wrote of James Burnham, who wrote The Managerial Revolution, which is that Burnham's error is in always predicting the continuation of the thing that is happening. So you see this error everywhere. I mean, that was 1947.
Yeah, but in this case, Burnham was right.
Well, Burnham was right about a large part of the managerial revolution. That's true. But I don't think that he would look at what we see around and say that he's predicted a linear line to that. He would be proud of his prediction about the managerial class. But the continuation of the thing that is happening, I think, is an error that a huge number of people fall into. And so I solve that by my combination of doomerism and optimism. I do not predict the continuation of the thing that is happening, though I am somewhat, I'm not overly bold in making predictions about what precisely the future will hold. I merely think it will be different and can be better.
Yeah, well, because you also advocate for the idea that a new elite will rise, and I think like there is kind of a spawning new elite that is already kind of throwing off the chains of limbic capitalism, and it's you can see this in like everyone's fasting in Silicon Valley. They're all doing Spartan races. They're torturing themselves in ways that, monks on the mountain of Athos are, doing occasionally. And it's a very different class of leader. They're not fat and happy. They're miserable.
Yeah. I'm not sure that I think the new elite will be largely have a high representation of people who used to be in Silicon Valley, but I could be wrong. And it's not. I'm not a Silicon Valley guy, though I know a fair amount of people there. So it's not clear to me what the current under the surface are. That is, on the surface, everyone has to kind of pay obeisance to the latest woke craziness, but it may well be that there's plenty of people under the surface who are the elite in waiting. I suspect that at least there's some degree of truth to that. We'll find. I mean, that assumes, of course, California doesn't simply fall into the ocean, and thus getting rid of everybody in California, which would certainly be sad. But if that doesn't happen, maybe they'll show up.
I think Silicon Valley is quite distributed. It's more of a state of mind. It's more of a tribe of people all around the world. Like we have a big contingent of Silicon Valley in London. They're everywhere, and it is interesting because being in the space, you hear about people getting funding from X and doing that, and I think there's quite a contingent of people doing things under the radar that's quite hopeful, and not just funding people, but like really supporting people in many ways. And there's a whole movement. I mean, Peter Thiel's the face of it, as much as he can be, even though we never see him, but at least we know of him. But I think there's quite a lot of people. It's gotten to the point where it's already starting to eat into their existence, and there people being attacked for absolutely random cultural revolution reasons, that they representation of trans people in their committee or something. So it's I think things are shifting in that way as well. But where do you see this elite being? Is there any geographic industry place where you see things bubbling up a little bit more?
Well, I'm in Indiana, which is not the hotbed of anything, and so Indiana is smack dab, more or less, in the middle of the country, and the closest relevant city is Chicago. I live near Indianapolis, which is accurately called Indiana No Place. And so, I lived in Chicago for a long time. I like Chicago, but I can't say that I'm connected to. I mean, I'm connected, obviously, to a variety of people, and I think you're entirely right that there's a lot of Silicon Valley is in many places, and the same thing is true for organizing among people, broadly speaking, on the right. So I suspect it's the case that the current geographic incarnation of the United States is not long for this world, and that it is more likely to have some set of successor nations. And obviously the trope among most people is that the coasts will split off and then some center of the country will could potentially form a new nation. So I have no idea where the new elite is going to come from. I think in a large part that depends upon how we get from here to there. If we get from here to there because an asteroid hit us and killed 90% of the people, well, that's going to be a lot different than if we get from here to there through some other kind of set of troubles. So I think in the nature of things, it's kind of like you were saying about anarchy. People won't abide anarchy. People will, in any kind of society where there's opportunity, where they are allowed to, an elite will naturally form. And hopefully that's an elite based upon what those people can bring to that society rather than a purely extractive elite. History obviously has many examples of a purely extractive elite. We tend to focus, or at least I tend to focus, on societies with successful and worthwhile elites. But there's many examples, counterexamples to that as well. So you can't be too optimistic about the future. But I think it will be made manifest to us as it happens, and it's just a question of being prepared for that. The criticism that is obvious here, which I might as well address, is that it's easy to say, well, it's all going to become clear. It's all going to become clear. The criticism is that you're refusing to take a position, but you can't really predict the future. I just have a high degree of confidence the future will coalesce in a way that is likely to be much better than the future path we're on now.
Mm. Okay, and that kind of brings me to your own project because you have a kind of a train of thought that's building. I think it's called Foundationalism. It's your own kind of post-liberal offshoot, and I'm curious what are kind of the main principles? Why is this different from what other people think?
Right. So I'm trying to compete with Curtis Yarvin on setting forth programs, I guess. So foundationalism is, and I have, and will probably shortly publish here, what I like to call the Foundationalist Manifesto, which makes it sound like the Communist Manifesto, which it's not, obviously. But what I'm trying to do is outline a set of principles that around which people can coalesce in order to build a successful society. And the idea is that this isn't restorationism. I'm a big believer in that, and you see this a lot on the right, less on the post-liberal side, but it even exists there. You see people who are nostalgics. You see that your retrotopia, John Michael Greer. We're going to go back, and we're going to have Michael Lind talks about this too. We're going to have retroculture, and we're going to go back to the past. I mean, I just can't abide that because it's totally unrealistic. And fundamentally, what the principles of foundationalism are supposed to do is embody a realistic view of humanity, human nature, and history, and set forth a bunch of principles that several, 12 to be precise, principles that people can agree on and use to find other people who agree with them and act in concert to form a renewed society. So unlike the Communist Manifesto, which makes a bunch of claims about how things specifically need to be different and we need to remake and create a new type of man, we're not going to create a new type of man. We're going to take what agree upon principles which are reality-based, but which are antithetical in almost all cases to the current zeitgeist, to the Enlightenment zeitgeist, to the zeitgeist of modernity. We can agree that much of modernity is just terrible and we need to have a new society based upon certain founding principles. So foundationalism is designed to create a foundation for a new society. Though in fairness, I did not come up with the name myself. I actually put out a call for names on my site, and someone came up with that, who I will not name because he probably doesn't want to be doxxed. But there is a specific person. So a foundationalism is ever like a multi-generational success. I'm sure that guy will want to be named and get a statue of himself for naming the program. So my goal is, the purpose of this isn't that I'm going to be the foundationalist king. That has a certain limited attraction. But this will provide a pattern for people to work on forming a new and better society.
Mm-hmm. So you said 12 principles.
That's 12 principles. So I have. People keep asking me where my manifesto is, and the answer is it's basically written. But I I have trouble. I have about 2 million words, about 500 pieces written on the blog, and many of them revolve around this. I don't want to repeat everything I say, and I want to make it digestible. So I have trouble kind of condensing it down in a way that's valuable and adequately covers the principles. But I'm gonna. If people keep asking me why I haven't published it, I'm going to publish it. I'm also a little bit afraid people will think that it's going to be something new and wonderful, like, here's this, I've discovered cold fusion and here it is, people. I know you've been waiting. I mean, it's nothing I haven't said before. So maybe normally self-confidence is not something that I lack, but maybe I'm afraid that the people will look at it and spit and then quit visiting my site because I didn't provide something new and wonderful. But for example, let's just take one random principle of foundationalism, which is a reworking, and you see this in a bunch of my writings. And I think that the modern approach in the West generally, and in America specifically, to the roles of men and women is completely wrong. That is, you need to rework sex roles to be something that is in accord with reality. And that the specifics of that, you can go into different pieces. But one of the fundamental errors of the modern age is treating men and women as interchangeable. And so that you can't run a competent society on that basis. And so that's one of the principles. And I go into that in various writings, and I summarize it as one of the principles or pillars of foundationalism.
Yeah, so I think the kind of the innovation here is, at least to me, the idea that you're going to take a stand on questions of this matter, because the current ideal about relationships between men and women is that it's all in flux, and it's all progressing towards more freer, ever more harmonized relationships, and we're going to get to the truth through the marketplace of ideas, and we're going to have this positive friction where we all decide what's good and bad, and it's absolutely horrendous. Like, the result is not what's right. So are these 12 principles essentially just places where you're going to take a stand and say, okay, this is what we believe, people?
Yes, I think that's a great, I mean, I had not thought of it in those terms, but that's a great way of putting it. That is, historically in America, conservatism has viewed itself as taking a stand. I mean, famously, William Buckley, when he started National Review, talked about it taking a stand athwart history. That, of course, turned out to be completely false. Conservatism is modern American conservatism, or mainstream conservatism, has turned out to be nothing at all useful. Yarvin is fond of quoting a guy named Dabney, who is a Confederate general. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's an excellent quote that basically American conservatism is the handmaiden of progressivism and merely chases after it, saying it should slow down a little bit. That doesn't do. The quote is excellent, but that's what American conservatism has turned into. So what you have to do is you have to take a stand, and a new stand, one that's fundamentally, completely countercultural, because the current culture is terrible. So in order to not have a terrible culture, you have to take a stand on things that make a culture not terrible.
Yeah, and the root of these principles, is there any religious substructure to foundationalism? Is religion a part of it, or is it just this is what it is?
Virtue is a part of it, is an explicit part of it. Generally speaking, religion is not a necessary part of it. I believe in. I think Christianity is awesome and is the true religion, and everybody should join it. But I don't think I believe in what I call pluralism light, which is, I think you should allow, I think Christianity should probably be the established state religion, though I'm not necessarily hung up on that, broadly speaking, and you should have within certain parameters, you should have a high degree of toleration. I would, execute the Satanists kind of thing, maybe not execute, send them to an offshore island. But so I don't believe in total freedom of religion, for example. A society that does not have commonality of virtue is doomed, and much of that virtue historically comes from religion. Even if people, to some people or a significant number of people, don't actually believe the religion, adherence to the public adherence to a religion is something that is useful for virtue. And I don't mean to adopt the instrumentalist view of religion at all that some people adopt, but a society needs common things, and a dominant religion is almost certainly one of those. But most definitely a dominant set of agreed upon virtues is one of those.
Yeah, there's actually another strain of kind of post-liberal thinking in integralism. I'm curious what your feeling about that direction is. To
Well,
religion?
I reviewed what was the guy's name? The book about Louis the Ninth, King Louis the Ninth of France, Before Church and State. That was the name of the book, which is basically a book about integralism, and it was very interesting from a historical matter. But I'm not Roman Catholic. I was originally Roman Catholic. I'm Orthodox now, and I think that integralism is a interesting theory, but doesn't work in practice, and no one's buying what those people are selling. And so, and I have a very dim view of Adrian Vermeule, for example, aside from the fact he blocked me on Twitter for no apparent reason. Apparently he blocks everybody on Twitter. So, well, I don't really care. It's just interesting to me because I'm not like super famous or anything. So I guess I rate being blocked by Adrian Vermeule. But, Vermeule is the biggest public proponent of integralism, and he's a clown. And you can tell that by the fact that he never does anything that would get him in trouble with his masters, like going out on Harvard Yard and protesting against abortion. And so he talks about integralism, but basically integralism is shadow play because nobody's buying what those people are selling. And in case they haven't checked, the current Pope isn't even buying what they're selling. So you'd have to have an entirely new Catholic Church in order to have integralism. If you think of integralism as broader, more broadly viewed, not just Roman Catholicism, but rather having the church govern the state, that also tends to work out poorly. I'm more in favor of Caesaropapism, where there is a close relationship between the government and religious leaders, and they act in concert. But I think in a state, the secular authority needs to be the ultimate authority over secular matters, and therefore integralism isn't likely to work in any meaningful way.
Yeah, it does seem to me like kind of it is pretty fringe, you know. I mean, I'm just thinking, you know, I'm Catholic. I'm not very Catholic. I'm not that Catholic for sure. But I, you know, kind of from almost like, you know, a functional perspective, I'd be like, yeah, I would probably adhere to an integral state rather than have whatever is coming on down the pipeline. But it is like you said, it's not mainstream. It doesn't seem to be having any, even in Catholic circles, any big traction.
I shouldn't rule it out entirely because, as I say, you can't predict the future. So you could imagine, for example, a massive worldwide or Western religious awakening where everyone suddenly is in fact buying what they're selling, and
Can you imagine that?
they demand. Well, no, not really. I can't. But you could theoretically imagine people demanding an integralist state with Adrian, tubby little Adrian Vermeule as their new maximum leader. There's so much for this Haywood guy. He's a terrible maximum leader. Let's have Adrian Vermeule. I don't think that's very likely.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what's coming, but like you said, you know, the future is unpredictable. You also mentioned the transhumanism, you know, that you're not interested in transhumanism, or you think it's absolutely nuts. Isn't the singularity upon us? You know, how should we navigate the fear of that?
The singularity is a silly fiction. The singularity is never going to happen. Nothing approaching the singularity is ever going to happen. Strong AI is a crock. Autonomous cars are not coming. None of this stuff is going to happen. These things are all just fantasies, and they're fantasies in part because people don't want to face reality, and in part because people get money out of them. It's a grift. I've been paying attention for 30 years to this stuff, and Ray Kurzweil 20 years ago was telling me how all of us by 2008 we're going to upload our brains. And so I mean, all this stuff is silly. And I was thinking the other day about, you probably don't remember this, but the entire American presidential campaign in 2004 was run around how bad Republicans were preventing stem cell research from curing everything that ailed us. And stem cells, of course, have done nothing at all in the past 20 years. And maybe they will, maybe they won't have some therapeutic value down the road. But I realized, actually just the other day, I was sitting around thinking for some reason, that why in 2004 that happened. It's because the baby boomers, the worst generation in human history, were right at that moment reaching the point where everything was starting to break. And they wanted to be sold this fantasy that they could live forever through this new magical thing called stem cells. And then if that failed, then they could upload their brains, because Ray Kurzweil told them that. And there's no evidence any of these things are going anywhere. I mean, sure, I could be wrong, but these things are all fantasies. It's like talking about how I have a gnome who lives under the stairs who cleans my toenails. I mean, I can say that, but it's not true. I don't have a gnome who lives under the stairs. I clean my own toenails, and it just doesn't make any sense to say anything else. And so I really get, as you can tell, worked up about people who predict the singularity, because it's just an insane idea with no evidence whatsoever in support of it. And it's a way for people to avoid having to deal with the reality of the society we have, the reality of human nature, and that we all need to muddle through this together rather than hoping we're all going to be uploaded in some awesome pan consciousness. Not that I'm worked up or anything.
Yeah, it's I feel like it does appeal to a certain type of a tech person, like very high in uncoupling, and someone who can actually imagine themselves as like a homunculus driving a skin suit, and
yeah.
To me that's kind of where I drifted. That's kind of my inflection point with post-liberalism. When I realized that the conception of the individual in just the rational individual has absolutely no bearing with reality. The idea that you're just there behind your eyes making decisions, being smart about things. You're not the one making decisions. Two, you're not being very smart about things, and so anything from the weather to stubbing your toe is going to completely alter your relationship to rationality. So that's kind of also where my departure point is from transhumanism. I'm like, this whatever this storm of feelings and hormones is that's happening and manifesting right now, it's not uploadable, it's not even comprehensible, and we're not going to get it however much we try to codify it or whatever. And even if we will upload it, it's not going to be me. It's going to be
exactly. I mean, this is like the famous argument in Star Trek: if you're transported, is it really you? But it's not you. I mean, I'm a believer that Star Trek transporter kills people and then creates new people. But leaving that aside, even if we, as you say, even if we could upload ourselves, it wouldn't be real. I mean, this is actually an interesting theological thing. Not to take a complete detour, but standard Nicene Creed Christianity holds that the resurrection of the body, that is, the body is an integral part of us as humans. And so divorcing the Gnostic idea that we're really our pure spirit weighed down by these flesh skins is actually completely anti-human. And that's what you see in these Silicon Valley transhumanist types. They believe that these things can be done that would destroy our humanity, but perhaps more importantly, it's never going to happen. And there's just no evidence any of these things are even remotely possible. I mean, we can't. I did a review of William Gibson's Neuromancer last year, in which I railed about this, that we're promised all of these technological changes and they don't happen, and that's a distraction. I mean, I'm a big fan of certain forms of technology. I think you can advance certain forms of technology, but I don't think all technology is not the same. Some technologies just are never going to happen, and those primarily relate to the ones that revolve around intelligence. So I could be wrong, as I keep saying, that should be my catchphrase for this interview, but there's nothing to suggest whatsoever that we're making any progress towards duplicating intelligence. So we should simply focus on taking humans as they are and making accomplishments with that, rather than chasing these fantasies about how we're going to create new intelligences or we're all going to live forever or what have you.
I keep hearing this argument about essentially Gnosticism being the beast that we're fighting. I think Sora Bamari makes it in his new book. There's Huapulos talks about this all the time, and in a way, I think it's quite plausible. The idea that the body is kind of toxic, and the idea that you kind of have to transcend the human world, and it's essentially kind of historicism. It's Hegelianism in a religious frame, and that's kind of, it feels like an animating force. It feels like the presumption of modernity, that this is, you have to overcome the body, and you have to just we're going to transcend, the rapture's coming, but it's not going to be a religious rapture. It's going to be done through AI, or I don't know, the singularity.
I mean, even if you could do that, one of the, or perhaps the fundamental modern societal problem is atomization and alienation. Again, this is not news or original to me, but if you could engage in some kind of Gnostic implementation where people supersede their bodies, it seems to me obvious that you would simply have more atomization and alienation rather than happiness for your disembodied or transhumanist people. They would simply feel alienated, and it'd be like waking up. In some ways, you wake up in a sensory deprivation tank and there you are. I mean, that's just terrible. Why would you do that? I mean, I understand that you wouldn't really be in a sensory deprivation tank, but you'd have that feeling of disconnectedness simply because people are not the sum of their spirit and their body. And I understand that the Gnostic heresy is, of course, probably the oldest Christian heresy, and it must have a lot of visceral appeal to people, this idea of transcending themselves. But it doesn't seem to me that it holds up under any significant amount of thought. If you think about it a little bit, it obviously, other than the immortality aspect, which I understand why people want, I don't see why you would want that.
Yeah, I think it appeals to a certain type of person who's already kind of maybe alienated, kind of introverted, maybe more techie type of person who can kind of imagine themselves a bit, like a brain in a vat, and who sees absolution, from the alienation of this world into, the world of hyperstimulus, the world of video games, essentially, because that's what people imagine, the upload is going to be this perfectly immersive video game where, women give you attention, where
well, that's a lot of it. I mean, you're not a loser anymore, right? In the video game,
you're whoever you want to be. Yeah.
Adrian Vermeule is now 10 feet tall and buff, rather than tubby little Pied Piper, as I called him one of my reviews. And guys, so
I will not stand for this infighting. I think Adrian's scheduled to come on the podcast. Just saying.
Oh, I'm sorry. You can cut that part out.
No worries. It's subversive. It has to stay in.
If he unblocks me on Twitter, then not only will I be exposed to his incredibly insightful takes again, then I'll be nice to him. Sorry, I'll be nice to you.
It's all good. No worries. I mean, this is a dissident podcast. We've got pirate radio vibes. This is the Howard Stern of the post-liberal left slash right slash whatever this is. So yeah,
have you ever heard I think it's John Hyatt, who's a folk rock singer, has a song called Pirate Radio. You should go look it up. It's actually quite a good song.
Yeah, I will.
You can make it your intro music or something.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of covered the main areas I wanted to ask you. I also wanted to ask you about accelerationism, but that kind of falls pretty much into the Neoreaction thing, and also the transhumanism thing. So we've kind of shot that out of the air. But then that leads me to, I want to ask you about The Demon in Democracy, because that is the book that you talk about the most. You essentially talk about it almost every time you talk about anything. Yeah, so I'm curious, like, what is the main insight? Was that kind of your aha moment book, or?
Probably. I read, so this is Ryszard Legutko, who's a Polish philosopher / parliamentarian, and he wrote the book The Demon in Democracy, which I read. I was on a cruise ship, maybe early 2017 in the Caribbean. The family was on a cruise ship, and I took that book along for some reason. And as I said in my review of it, this is the book that explains it all to you. And so it's actually an excellent point. If you're going to start somewhere, I would start there. And it's a short book. And if it started for me, it arguably at least started there, or at least came to full flower there. So Legutko describes why the nature of liberal democracy is poisonous in essence, or contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. And he also explains or views it through the frame of why, after the fall of communism, rather than communists becoming sidelined, communists slotted right into the new system of liberal democracy, and that the people of Central and Eastern Europe didn't get what they wanted, but they rather got a blend of the common elements of communism and liberal democracy, what Legutko calls, in the phrase I typically quote, coercion to freedom, which is that you will have total freedom to do what you want as long as that fits in within the demands for emancipation that are inherent in liberal democracy and the Enlightenment program. He doesn't use this phrase, but it's also emblematized, that's not a word, but emblematized by the phrase you see sometimes, I can tolerate anything but intolerance. So the idea that you can believe whatever you want as long as it comports with the poisonous doctrines of the Enlightenment and liberal democracy. I have a pretty good review of it. The book is only like 150 pages. Everybody should read it. He's come out with a book since, which I haven't read yet, though I have a copy. So I highly recommend Legutko as kind of a introduction to the idea of post-liberalism as a rejection of the liberal democratic world order.
Yeah, you should record it. I don't think you have, because
I'm working backward. So I'm almost. So I started recording them, and so I'm working backward. I'm almost through 2018, and that's back in 2017. So I work backward through the old ones in recording. I try to put up 2 things a week, either written. For a while, I was writing 2 or 3 new pieces a week. I've slowed down a bit, but there's a lot of stuff. Darren Beatty did me the favor yesterday of publishing on. He didn't talk to me about it. I don't know Darren Beatty, but Revolver News published my most recent piece on Glass House, which is about it's a business political economy piece on the front page of Revolver News. So I'm getting thousands of reads now from on that piece, which is nice. So I did put that up recently.
That's excellent. I think Darren's definitely a good pipeline to be in for he's posted mine a few times. He never tells, but I can tell if I look at my analytics.
Yeah, no, I saw a spike. So I mean, it's funny. I can't tell what's going to be popular sometimes. I mean, some things get I don't know, a couple thousand views. Some get 20,000 views or reads, depending on how you look at it. Sometimes I think things are going to be wildly popular, and then I publish them and they're not that popular. And then sometimes I published a 30,000 word piece on what I call the Brondo tyranny, which is about my term for the clown show of our current tyranny, our current government. But it was hyper analytical. It was all very legal, and people just loved it. I'm like, what the hell? Who has time to stand and read this obscure legalese that I wrote out? So it's funny that sometimes people like stuff I don't think they will, and vice versa.
I think that's I read that one. I listened to it, to be honest, which is almost as good as reading it, almost as legitimate. And I think the innovation about that one was it's because typically when you present your thought, it's very much in kind of in mirroring some other person's thought, and you kind of say, okay, this is stupid, this is smart, I like this, I don't like that. But that one was kind of probably the longest piece of your own ideas. And
it was.
Yeah,
and
so I think
my wife says the same thing, that the people demand your original thoughts, and so, which is very flattering. So of course I think that must be right.
You were coining a phrase. People love coining a phrase,
yeah, okay, I can see that.
Yeah.
Okay, right. The book reviews to me are interesting, but you're right. I mean, they're derivative in a sense. The derivative of and as I like to say, I'm not really doing book reviews. I'm using them as a vehicle for my own thoughts. And if you don't like it, you're in the wrong place. But nonetheless, they're derivative of other people's thoughts, because tends to be used as the frame, even though I tend to also go very far afield in many of my reviews. It comes back to whatever I'm reviewing ultimately.
Yeah, and I think I really love the book reviews. I mean, I think that's a lot of times how people find out, how people discover your stuff, and then they see, kind of you take these positions. Sometimes they're a bit, extreme for the normie, and then people want to they want to know why, how come, how
Well,
have you come?
that's also why you hear a lot of people when they on podcasts, they're like, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and give us 5 stars. I never bother because a lot of my reviews are negative because people are searching for something about a book and they have never heard of me, and then they listen to it and they're like, what the hell is this? This is terrible. This guy is awful. And they leave a 1-star review. So I accept that I'll never be well reviewed on Apple Podcasts because normies who think totally differently are appalled by my thoughts that they just come to when they want to learn about a book. Sorry about that.
I think it's it's quite interesting that you do review leftist books as well, or you have. I think you
I
said that you
have.
don't really want to do it anymore. It's so
Well, it's
draining.
shooting
But
fish in a barrel, right? It's shooting fish in a barrel and kind of a waste of time. But I might occasionally. I might be inspired. Let's put it that way.
yeah, some of the the highlights. I think you there was like this anarchist handbook or something that you no, the Antifa handbook
Antifa
that you
handbook, yeah. Right. That's a good example because I did that after I said I was going to stop reviewing leftist books. So I think I said I'll not review leftist books simply to dissect them. I'll only do it as part of a larger thing. And so the Antifa thing was done to get a better understanding of the enemy rather than simply to say why they were wrong, because that's self-evident and not particularly helpful.
yeah, to be honest, your reviews are about as close as I get to interacting with this material. So I'm grateful.
Public service.
Yeah, it is good. We need it. I don't want to be one of those completely ignorant right wing, freaks that's just like, I don't know, listens to Rush Limbaugh or whatever. And
No, and I mean, Rush Limbaugh was, I think, good for what he was, and he was very important for a variety of reasons. But I can never get into like the talk radio or Mark Levin or these people.
yeah, no, I
I'm not.
haven't done that either. But it's interesting. That's kind of the stereotype. Someone in their basement, listening to
Yes, exactly.
someone rambling. So I also want to ask you the question of the show, which is, yeah, do you have a subversive thinker that you think is not getting enough spotlight, enough interest?
Well, I do, and in fact, I'm prepared for this question. Can I name 2?
Yeah, name as many as you want for sure.
Okay. So I came up with 2. Both of which I've reviewed once or twice on my site. So, and both of which are, I hesitate a little bit to name these 2 because the commonality between them will make it look like I'm more dubious than I am, but I'll do it anyway. So, Carl Schmitt and Ernst Junger. These aren't that obscure. So I noticed, for example, Amari in his podcast with you named Juan Donoso Cortez as his person. Now Cortez is more obscure than either of these guys. But so I think Carl Schmitt is extremely valuable because he is the kind of modern theorist of power and the enemy, both things which are of great interest to me. So I, for example, can recommend a couple. I haven't read by any means all of Schmitt's stuff. I would actually recommend people try a book by a guy named Gopal Balakrishnan, who wrote a book summarizing a lot of Schmitt's thought a couple of years ago called The Enemy, the writings or the thought of Carl Schmitt, which does a good job of talking about it. But I think Schmitt has a great deal to say about our current moment, as particularly the friend-enemy distinction, the importance of viewing enemies not ideologically but politically, something that the left fails to do, which causes no end of catastrophic problems historically. And he has just a lot of interesting things to say that will bear fruit, I think, in the upcoming times. He talks a lot of, one of Schmitt's concepts is the katechon, which is a concept from Second Thessalonians about the force that restrains the Antichrist, which is not, we're not talking a spiritual force here, but it says a lot about what our future will look like as pressure builds up within the system. So I think that kind of stuff is very worth reading. And I actually think he's very difficult to read. I mean, I don't read him don't have enough German I have hardly any German anymore. So it's all in English translation. His books are expensive, hard to get, difficult to read. So it's a real commitment. Junger is less of a commitment. Everyone thinks of Junger as kind of coterminous with Schmitt, and yes, they are both Germans from the 20th century involved in the conservative revolution during Weimar, and they have a certain commonality in that they're both opposed to liberal democracy, but they're very different. Everyone thinks of Junger as normally for his book, The Storm of Steel, which is about his experience in World War I, which is interesting, but I think not particularly relevant. I read 2 books of his, which I have reviews of, which are actually probably the reviews I'm proudest of or happiest with. The Forest Passage and Humusville, which are, one is a book of philosophy about what he calls the anarch, which is frequently but wrongly taken to be a libertarian conception of how one should live. And Humusville is a decades later book written as dystopian science fiction. So you wouldn't think those 2 things cover the same ground, but they do, and they relate to how a person should live in difficult times, and in particular, how we should live under the tyranny of liberal democracy. They are not, as they are commonly read, books about Nazism or more traditional tyrannies, but rather about the more applicable tyrannies of the modern world, which is why I think they're so valuable. Junger wrote many other things. I've read some of them, not others. They're all very interesting, but that's what I would recommend for the specific answer to the question. I would read Schmitt, and I would read those 2 books of Ernst Junger.
Yeah, I think people are starting to be a bit more interested in Schmitt, because there's the meme about the friend enemy distinction that's just making its rounds across the.
And it's a much longer topic, and I'm not really qualified to go into in all details, but it is very much worth looking at.
Yeah, I'm curious. One more question kind of cropped up in the idea that we're looking for the post-liberal, not solution, but we're kind of exploring the post-liberal space. Michael Millerman was on the podcast recently, and he's kind of a scholar of Dugin. Dugin's obviously a guy who's like loaded with a lot of connotations. No one likes him. He's a weirdo. But
that's what they say about me too. What the hell?
Well, you have something in common. He is working on something called, the fourth political theory. I'm curious if have you looked into this? Have you explored the Duginist space at all?
I have not, and I've thought that I should do that, but I have a lot of other things I think I should do, and I never get around to it. And as you say, he has a reputation as being odd.
It is. So he is odd, but to be honest, I think Millerman makes an interesting case. He has a few podcasts about what is contained in the fourth political theory. He's probably the best scholar on Dugin, and he's putting out a course on Dugin now as well. Okay. If you want an intermediary to
no, I will
parse him, I think he's really interesting.
I've not listened to that podcast. I've listened to most of the podcasts, but I've not listened to that one. So now I will go and do that.
Oh yeah, no, I haven't published it yet, because to be honest,
I'm like.
No, it's gonna come out, and he has his own podcast, Millerman Talks. So yeah, if you're curious before that, it's really good. I'm building up episodes right now, because I'm gonna have a baby any minute now.
Which is awesome. I strongly encourage everyone to have lots of children. So we need more children, boy or girl.
Boy, it's gonna be a boy.
Boy, I think
a leader of men.
Maybe he'll be the man of destiny. He'll pick up the crown of France with his sword, or the crown of something with his sword.
Crown of Western Transylvania. Maybe we'll see. Yeah, well, we're going back to city states, guys. It's coming.
Maybe. Well, I know you mentioned the Saxon towns on your podcast before, and I've seen some of those too, obviously, in the. They're very impressive fortifications, just right for a small city-state. So
we definitely have them. I mean, they're probably the most impressive thing, because we've had some Mongol infestations and things like that. So
well, the Saxons are all gone now, aren't they? Didn't they all move back to Germany?
For the most part. Yeah. There's some tensions, so no reason to stay behind. They had to, they sat here for about like 300-400 years. Enough.
Yeah.
It's got nicer.
Yeah, I mean, that's change is inevitable, and you see that. And not to go off on a tangent, but the demographic change is inevitable, and a lot of people. It's sad the Saxons are gone, but you understand why that is, and that my biggest concern is that everyone's going to be gone if people don't start having children. So, and I saw the other day the New York Times came out with an article, and I've been pounding this drum for a while, but the New York Times came out with an article about how, which gives it official mainstream imprimatur, that that the population collapse is our real problem, not population growth.
Yeah, it's definitely a big thing. I've thought about it. I'm, being kind of in the context of, thinking about it every day if I want to or not. Yeah, it's a looming issue, and there's so many things that could be at the root of it, or maybe probably are at the same
Yeah.
time. Yeah, so yeah, it's another topic for another very long
Yes.
conversation. But thank you so much, Charles. This was lovely to get to
My
chat to
pleasure.
you,
Thank you.
and thank you for all you're doing. I mean, this is very very useful work, and I'm keen to see you on more of the Anton podcast, on more of the Revolver News. You get around there and yeah, spread the gospel.
I'll do my best. I likewise for you. I find your podcast to be extremely illuminating, and I enjoy the wide variety of guests. And there will I have actually recorded another Anton podcast, so there will be another one of those coming up next month sometime. So spicy takes all around.
Perfect. Well, that's what we've come to expect. And where can people find your work, your links, your things?
The best place is theworthyhouse.com, theworthyhouse.com. I encourage people to sign up for email notifications. I do not accept money or ask you for money or have ads. So I merely think people should sign up to get notifications, so that they can know when I do writings. I also am on Twitter and YouTube and so on, but you can never tell when those things will disappear. So I encourage people to go to the main site from where you can get written versions and audio versions and what have you.
Exactly. Yeah. So I recommend that people do that as well. It's a very worthwhile place to spend a few lots of
Thank
hours.
you.
Perfect. Well, thanks again for coming on.
Thank you very much. Nice to talk to you.